Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning with Story 1. Life inside a 12th century peasant cottage. In the quiet, weather-worn landscape of 12th century Europe, most people lived not in castles or manors, but in small, humble cottages, homes that offered shelter, but only just. You might imagine a peasant's house as a structure of rough stone and damp wood, which it often was. But to truly understand these homes, you must let go of modern expectations: no insulation, no plumbing, no glass windows. These homes were not built for comfort, but for function and survival. A house built by hand. A typical peasant dwelling began with what the land could offer. In forested regions, timber framed the structure. In rocky areas, stone. Wattle and daub woven sticks packed with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw often filled the gaps. Thatch from reeds or straw layered thickly across a wooden roof frame offered basic protection from rain, though it needed frequent maintenance and was highly flammable. Flooring, if you could call it that, was earth, perhaps mixed with straw, trodden until it compacted hard. Over time, it became oily and dark from spilled food, ash, and muddy feet. Some homes were partially sunken into the ground, using the earth's natural insulation to trap warmth, a subtle, practical decision in a world where every ounce of heat mattered. No plans were drawn. The design was passed on through generations, an oral tradition of rural architecture. Walls leaned, roofs sagged, but they stood. One room, many lives. Most peasant cottages were single-roomed. All of life, eating, sleeping, birthing, dying, happened within the same four walls. There was rarely a ceiling, just exposed beams blackened with soot. Smoke from the central hearth vented through a hole in the roof, if at all. Many cottages simply filled with smoke, which darkened walls and lungs alike. Despite the smoke, the hearth was the heart of the home. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook. A single pot hung on a trammel hook or balanced over the flames. It simmered constantly, filled with a stew that changed day by day with whatever scraps were available. If you stood by that hearth, you'd smell turnip, leeks, and maybe yesterday's fish. Furnishings were minimal. A three-legged stool, perhaps a bench, a rough table. Most slept on straw bedding, loose, itchy, and alive with fleas. The bedding might be placed on a wooden frame or simply spread on the floor. Personal items were stored in wooden chests, the only form of secure storage. Tools might hang from nails in the wall. If a family owned metalware spoons, a knife, it was treasured and rarely misplaced. Shared with beasts. Livestock were valuable and often kept close, sometimes inside the house. In colder months, a goat or pig might share the family's single room, its warmth helping ward off frost. Larger cottages had a partition or separate stall at the end of the room for animals. The line between human and beast was thin. The result was a mingling of smells: damp straw, animal waste, unwashed bodies, cooking food, and smoke. This was the medieval perfume of survival. The roof above. Roofs made of thatch were common, especially in England and northern Europe. They were made by tying bundles of straw or reed together and layering them over wooden battens. A well-made thatch roof could last 20 years but required constant patching. Bugs lived in the thatch: spiders, beetles, lice, and sometimes birds nested in it. It wasn't uncommon to wake to scratching sounds above or to find droppings in your bedding. Despite this, thatch was warm and surprisingly waterproof. It was also cheap, and that made it indispensable. Letting in the light and cold. Windows, if present, were tiny, perhaps a single slit, covered with oiled parchment or thin cloth to keep out wind. Glass was a luxury far beyond the reach of most peasants. Light came through the open door or filtered weakly through gaps in the wall. When wind whistled through these openings in winter, people stuffed them with rags or moss. Darkness was a daily reality after sunset. The village cluster. Most cottages weren't isolated. They stood close to one another in small villages, clustered like mushrooms near fields and forests. Proximity offered protection, community, and shared resources. The blacksmith, the mill, the village oven all were communal. Yet privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. Everything was shared: meals, chores, beds, burdens. A child might be raised by a whole village. Illness spread quickly, as did gossip and stories. And still people endured. They worked the land, bore children, tended animals, and kept their cottages upright against rain, wind, and time. It was, for them, enough. But if these homes were so prone to cold, damp, and disease, why didn't people build differently? What stopped innovation in their dwellings? The medieval peasant home, humble as it was, persisted in its simplicity for centuries. At first glance, it may seem baffling. Why didn't things improve faster? Why didn't the thatch give way to tiled roofs sooner, or dirt floors to wooden planks? The answer lies not just in materials or knowledge, but in a deeply layered web of constraints: economic, social, and environmental. To understand why the medieval home remained so stagnant, one must peel back the layers of medieval life itself. The grip of landlords and lords. To build something better, you must first own the land. Most medieval peasants did not. They were tenants or serfs, bound by obligations to a local lord or manor. Even if a family lived on the same plot of land for generations, they rarely had legal ownership. Their homes, though built by their hands, stood on land that could be reclaimed at any time by the noble who held the rights to it. Investing time, labor, or money into a long-term improvement made little sense if your claim could be revoked with the stroke of a quill. What incentive was there to add a second room, reinforce the walls, or import more durable materials? The short answer: very little. Even free peasants, who did not owe labor service to a lord, still faced similar insecurity due to the fragility of rural legal systems and the threat of war, famine, or forced relocation. This tenuous relationship with the land shaped everything. The weight of custom and tradition. While it's tempting to view medieval peasants as backward or resistant to change, their conservatism had rational roots. In a village, traditions were not just cultural, they were practical blueprints for survival. The size, orientation, and layout of cottages followed generations of trial and error. If your father's house had stood through 30 winters, why change it? Deviation from the norm also invited suspicion. Medieval communities could be remarkably rigid, and novelty, especially architectural novelty, was seen as either suspicious or wasteful. A more elaborate cottage might draw envy, rumors of pridefulness, or even the wrath of a lord expecting higher rents. Better to be humble and blend in. A shortage of tools and time. Building a house requires tools, and even basic ones were expensive. An iron axe, saw, or hammer was beyond the reach of many peasants. Most tools were shared, handed down, or repaired again and again. Then there was the issue of time. A peasant's calendar was dictated by the land. Planting, tending, harvesting, repairing fences, feeding animals, hauling water, daily life was full and exhausting. Major improvements to housing would require extended labor, which meant time taken away from the fields. That could mean less food. Less food meant hunger, and hunger was never far away. So the goal of a peasant home was not transformation, it was maintenance. Patch the thatch, replace a beam, reseal the daub, keep the smoke hole clear. Let it stand another season. Material scarcity. Unlike today's world of hardware stores and supply chains, medieval builders used what was close at hand. If you lived in a wooded region, timber was more accessible but still required felling, transporting, cutting. In stony areas, field stones could be gathered, but this too demanded effort and tools. Thatch required an annual harvest of reeds or straw, bound by hand and hoisted onto the roof. Clay for daub had to be dug, mixed with dung and chopped straw, then applied in layers that required weeks to dry. Everything took time, everything required energy. Bricks, tiles, or mortar, those were luxuries reserved for manorial buildings, churches, and wealthy townsfolk. A peasant might see a brick structure once in a lifetime, perhaps on a pilgrimage or market day in a distant town. Fire as the constant threat. Ironically, even as cottages remained simple, they were highly vulnerable. Fire was the greatest enemy of the peasant home. Open hearths, dry thatch, wooden beams, flammable walls all came together in dangerous harmony. A single stray ember, a knocked-over oil lamp, or a moment of inattention could destroy a home in minutes. There are records from manorial courts where peasants were fined for allowing their chimneys to catch fire, though the chimney might have been little more than a smoke hole. Some villages tried to regulate roof types or outlaw open flame near certain structures, but enforcement was rare. And so, many rebuilt again and again on the same plots, with the same materials, repeating the cycle. The cottage remained both a sanctuary and a risk. Adaptations within constraint. But all was not entirely static. Slowly, subtly, peasants adapted. Some families built low stone walls around the base of their timber cottages to prevent flooding. Others widened smoke holes or added wooden flues to reduce smoke inhalation. Simple windows were shuttered in colder months with wooden boards. Doors, once just animal hides, gave way to crude wooden planks. Families who prospered perhaps through surplus harvests or good fortune sometimes expanded their homes to 2 rooms. One might be used for cooking and living, the other for sleeping. But this was rare. More commonly, a better-off peasant might improve insulation by adding woven mats to walls or keeping livestock indoors longer in winter. A thicker thatch could keep out the rain for an extra season. These were minor evolutions, born from hard-won experience. Town life, a contrast in walls. In growing medieval towns, construction was more varied. Homes there were often built close together, with timber-framed upper stories jutting out over narrow streets. Fire was even more dangerous in these urban settings. Town dwellers might have tiled roofs, plastered walls, or even glazed windows, though still reserved for the wealthy. Guilds sometimes oversaw construction quality, offering a level of standardization and accountability absent in rural life. Yet even here in the more advanced medieval settlements, most lived simply. Water had to be fetched, floors were often bare, and privacy remained minimal. The divide between peasant and noble, or between rural and urban, was not absolute, but it was significant. Slow knowledge, slow change. There was no YouTube tutorial, no library, no architect. Building techniques spread slowly, and even then, often through imitation rather than instruction. A traveling mason, carpenter, or monk might introduce a new method, but adoption was cautious. It took generations, not years, for architectural change to ripple through the countryside. The Black Death in the 14th century would later shake this pattern by reducing population and increasing labor value, but in the 12th century, such changes were still far away. So the question remains, for a medieval peasant with limited tools, no land ownership, scarce time, and little outside knowledge, was the cottage truly their own? Or was it something inherited, a structure built as much by constraint as by choice? And if so, what did home really mean to them? If the medieval peasant home was cold, cramped, dark, smoky, and built by necessity rather than design, it may be tempting to view it solely as a burden, a shelter shaped by hardship. But that would be a mistake. Despite its discomforts, the home meant something profound in the medieval world. It was more than just a roof. It was the anchor of identity, inheritance, labor, and life itself. This final section explores how peasants used these spaces not only to survive, but to preserve memory, shape community, and pass something on. the cottage as a family legacy. Even without legal ownership, cottages were passed from parent to child, generation to generation. Inheritance customs varied by region: partible inheritance in some areas, primogeniture in others, but the family house was central to continuity. Children were often born on straw bedding by the hearth. The same place, years later, might host their wedding feast, and eventually their funeral rites. The cottage bore silent witness to entire life cycles. In a world without much mobility, most peasants never strayed more than a few miles from their birthplace. A family cottage became a constant. Even as it aged, sagged, or partially collapsed, the home embodied the family story. People took pride in their homes, however humble. Some adorned the walls with woven mats, religious tokens, or small wooden carvings. A few kept a chest of keepsakes: lace, dried flowers, or a misshapen candle stub. These were not luxuries but relics of memory. Seasonal life within the walls. Inside the cottage, daily life followed the rhythms of the seasons. In spring and summer, homes emptied early. Most of the day was spent in the fields. Children might stay behind to tend animals or fetch water. But winter transformed the space. Long nights meant entire families huddled inside from dusk to dawn. The hearth became the center of everything: heating a pot of gruel, drying damp wool, roasting a turnip, warming tired limbs. Stories were told, passed from grandmother to child, often in a low, smoke-tinged whisper. These weren't fairy tales but local lore: a drowned miller, a lost pig, the year the river froze. Sleep came early and communally. Privacy was virtually unknown. Parents, children, even guests might share a single bed or sleep wrapped in cloaks by the fire. Livestock might lie nearby, their breath warming the space, their smell a constant. Yet within this tight arrangement came intimacy, a closeness forged by necessity, but remembered in tenderness. The cottage as a site of work. A peasant home was not a retreat, it was a place of work. Women often spent their days here, spinning wool, kneading bread, tending children, curing meat. The hearth became an oven, a forge, and a kiln in one. Many households processed their own food. Barley and rye were ground into coarse meal using quernstones. Herbs were dried and stored in bundles hung from the beams. Cheese was pressed in cloths. Salt pork was hung to age. Everything had to be done in small batches, with limited light and space. Yet the home was also a production unit, not just a shelter. In homes with small side plots, gardens were kept nearby full of leeks, onions, cabbages, and herbs. These provided vital supplements to an otherwise bland diet. Sometimes, bees were kept in wicker skeps just outside the door, or chickens roamed just beyond the threshold. Home and the community. Although the cottage was physically distinct, it was not isolated. It was part of a communal rhythm. Neighboring homes were often just steps away. Walls might not separate them clearly. Children played in shared dirt yards. Dogs roamed freely. Voices carried. The communal oven was a vital center point. Most cottages lacked the resources to maintain a full oven, so villagers brought their loaves to the manorial or communal bakehouse. There, flatbreads and coarse loaves were baked for multiple households, marked with family symbols. This shared cooking arrangement meant food was often linked to gossip, trade, and exchange. Whose bread burned? Who baked with too much barley? Who snuck in during the night? Even the act of repairing one's roof was a community affair. A thatching bee where neighbors gathered to help rethatch a home was part labor, part social ritual. Work was shared, and news traveled through roofs, smoke holes, and open doorways. Ritual: faith in the home. Religious life was deeply embedded in the peasant household. A crucifix or religious icon might hang above the hearth. Palm branches from Easter, dried and yellowed, were sometimes tucked into the rafters. Holy water, when available, might be kept in a jar by the door to sprinkle on sick children. Homes were blessed by the parish priest, especially after misfortune or during plague seasons. Superstition filled the cracks: garlic to ward off illness, a broom placed by the door to trap evil spirits, or the mark of a saint's initials scratched into the lintel. Births and deaths were observed with candles and quiet prayer. A child's first steps or a relative's final words echoed in the same room across decades. The slow collapse. But nothing lasted forever. Cottages decayed, roofs rotted, beams bowed, walls slumped. Sometimes they were patched, filled with more daub, propped with new stakes. Other times they were abandoned. New homes might be built on the same footprint, the ground slowly rising with each generation of use, ashes and floor sweepings. Archaeologists today find these footprints: layers of compacted earth, scattered pottery shards, carbon smudges from hearths long gone. Each tells the story of endurance and of a home's slow return to the soil. What the home meant. Ultimately, for the medieval peasant, a cottage was never just a building. It was a crucible of life, a container for labor, suffering, joy, and quiet endurance. Its discomforts were real: the cold, the smoke, the leaks, the noise. But it was also a place of safety. When winter came and wolves howled in distant forests, or when illness spread through the village, people turned to their homes for comfort. In the end, the peasant cottage stood as a monument not to architecture or wealth, but to resilience. Its walls might have been crooked and its floors uneven, but it held within it the strength of survival. And as the wind howled across the open fields of medieval Europe, and the fire crackled low in a dark, smoky room, you might ask yourself, what will remain of the homes we build today, not in stone or wood, but in memory? Story 2. Personal hygiene in a time without soap. In our modern lives, hygiene is a quiet routine: brushing teeth, washing hands, showering. We take for granted the hum of running water, the comfort of hot baths, and the clean scent of soap. But for the people of medieval Europe, cleanliness was neither routine nor straightforward. And yet they didn't ignore it. Despite the reputation of the dirty Middle Ages, medieval people cared about cleanliness. They simply lived in a world where soap was rare, hot water was a luxury, and disease was poorly understood. Hygiene was shaped not by availability, but by adaptation of habits, rituals, and resilience. This section explores the quiet struggle for personal hygiene in a world without plumbing, antiseptics, or even consistent access to clean water. Water, nowhere. You might assume water was abundant in medieval Europe, and in a way, it was. Streams, rivers, wells, and rainwater barrels were common, but access did not guarantee cleanliness. Water was often dirty. Rivers flowing through towns doubled as open sewers. Wells could be contaminated. Rain barrels collected debris from thatched roofs teeming with insects, birds, and decay. Clean water, even when found, required effort: drawing it, carrying it, heating it. For a peasant especially, a woman responsible for household labor fetching water could mean multiple trips per day with heavy buckets. That water was used for cooking, brewing, laundry, and animals. Bathing came last, if at all. So people learned to conserve. They reused water, they washed with damp cloths, and they bathed only when necessary. Bathing infrequent but valued. Contrary to myth, medieval people did bathe, but not every day and not always with soap. Communal bathhouses existed in towns, inspired by Roman traditions. In places like Paris or London, public baths were used for centuries, especially during the 12th and 13th centuries. These bathhouses, often heated with wood fires, included separate pools or tubs for hot and cold bathing. Some even had changing rooms and steam rooms. But they came with complications: cost, crowding, and moral concerns. By the late Middle Ages, many bathhouses were associated with prostitution, and some were shut down during outbreaks of plague or moral reform campaigns. In rural areas, bathing was a home affair. A large wooden tub lined with cloth or straw for insulation was filled with warmed water. Entire families might share the same bath in succession, beginning with the eldest. Water was rarely changed. Because of the labor involved, baths were reserved for special occasions, weddings, feast days, or after childbirth. Most peasants bathed seasonally, not weekly. Soap scarce and harsh. Soap, when available, was homemade. It was made by boiling animal fat with lye and alkaline solution made from wood ash. The result was a crude, caustic soap that stung the skin, dried the hands, and often smelled faintly of tallow. This wasn't the perfumed bar soap of modern bathrooms. It was utilitarian and usually reserved for laundry or dishes. Some wealthier households had softer soaps imported from the Islamic world, especially from Aleppo or Moorish Spain. These olive oil-based soaps were gentler and often scented, but far beyond the means of ordinary folk. So instead, many people cleaned themselves with cloths and water alone. They scrubbed with sand, ash, or salt to remove dirt. Hair was brushed with bone combs, sometimes rinsed in vinegar or rainwater. Cleanliness was sought, but tools were few. The dirt we lived with. In medieval life, dirt wasn't just outside, it was inside the home, the bed, and the body. People were intimately acquainted with filth because it was everywhere. Straw bedding collected lice and fleas. Floors of beaten earth absorbed soot, waste, and food scraps. Clothing was worn until it was stiff with sweat and grime. Still, people tried. Shirts and underclothes were washed regularly when possible. These linen garments worn closest to the body were considered the first line of cleanliness. They were boiled in large vats, scrubbed with lye or soap if available, and beaten clean with paddles. In towns, women sometimes made a living doing laundry for others. Hair was cut short for children and sometimes shaved for monks or penitents. Delousing was a constant task done by comb, finger, or fire. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were so common that people developed elaborate euphemisms for them and folk remedies to chase them off. Powdered herbs were sprinkled into bedding. Wormwood, lavender, and pennyroyal were thought to help. Nails were trimmed with knives. Teeth were rubbed with linen cloth or chewed with twigs. People rinsed with salt water or herbs to freshen breath, even though dentistry, as we know it, did not exist. Religious cleanliness. Hygiene was not just practical, it was spiritual. Religious rituals emphasized cleanliness before prayer, pilgrimage, and communion. Monasteries had strict rules for washing hands, feet, and faces before meals or services. In abbeys, lavatorium stone basins with running water were built for this purpose. For many, a clean body reflected a clean soul. Yet paradoxically, extreme piety sometimes rejected bodily comfort. Some saints refused to bathe, wearing lice-infested hair shirts as acts of devotion. Dirt became a symbol of humility. But for the average believer, washing the face or hands was an everyday gesture of respect toward others and toward God. The itch, always the itch. Itching was constant. Without modern hygiene, lice and fleas thrived. It was common for people to scratch themselves absent-mindedly while talking, working, or even praying. Children had scabs behind their ears. Adults bore the small marks of insect bites. This wasn't seen as shameful, it was simply life. Still, people developed coping mechanisms. Hair was sometimes powdered with chalk or herbs to suffocate lice. Bedding was hung over fire smoke to kill pests. Clothes were brushed, frozen, or beaten with sticks to shake out bugs. Even language evolved to accommodate this reality. Medieval Latin included terms like pulex for flea and pediculus for louse, and numerous folk names and cures appeared in local dialects. Itching wasn't just a physical condition. It was the background music of medieval life. The smell of the Middle Ages. So what did medieval people smell like? Not as bad as you'd think, but not pleasant by modern standards. People covered odors with herbs, rosewater, or vinegar. They carried pomanders, scented balls, or cloths on belts or in pouches. In towns, dried flowers and spices were strewn on floors to freshen the air. Still, body odor was accepted as normal. A peasant returning from the fields was expected to smell of sweat and soil. A blacksmith reeked of smoke, a fisherman of brine. People smelled like their work, their homes, and their world, and they rarely noticed because everyone did. And so the question lingers. If cleanliness was so difficult, so costly, and so temporary, how did it shape one's sense of identity and self-worth in the medieval world? In the medieval world, hygiene was not merely a matter of health, it was also a matter of perception, social class, and religious virtue. Just as the poor toiled for the basics of physical cleanliness, the wealthy and the powerful found ways to elevate hygiene into something more symbolic, a performance of civility, grace, and superiority. But class was not the only factor. Across all layers of society, cleanliness intersected with morality, labor, reputation, and even politics. It could be a marker of nobility or an act of resistance. This section explores how hygiene was woven into the social fabric of the Middle Ages, shaping identities in ways both visible and invisible. The clean look of the powerful. For nobility and the wealthy, hygiene was part of their display of status. A clean appearance, shiny hair, perfumed skin, spotless linen was not only rare, it was intentional. Cleanliness was, in part, manufactured to distinguish themselves from the working masses. Lords and ladies often bathed more frequently, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, when bathing was in vogue among the aristocracy. Wealthier homes had dedicated bath chambers. Water was heated in copper cauldrons and poured into large wooden tubs lined with cloth. Servants carried the water and prepared the room. Perfumed oils and scented herbs were added to the bath: lavender, rose petals, chamomile. Towels were warmed by the fire. After bathing, the hair was combed, beards trimmed, and fingernails cleaned with specialized tools. Clothing was freshened with starch, pressed, and sometimes dusted with powdered fragrances. In the eyes of their peers, cleanliness implied refinement. Among the lower classes, it marked distance, both social and physical. Yet even the nobles couldn't escape the underlying truth. Water had to be hauled, wood had to be burned, soap had to be made. Servants, not lords, did the washing. Monks, nuns, and ritual cleanliness. In monastic communities, hygiene took on a highly ritualized form. Cleanliness was tied to obedience, discipline, and spiritual purity. Monks were required to wash their hands and faces regularly. The rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational guide for monastic life, dictated routines for cleanliness before prayer, meals, and sleep. Cloisters often had dedicated lavatoriums, long stone sinks with water channels fed by nearby springs or rain catchments. Monks bathed more frequently than peasants, though still modestly. Some monasteries even had rudimentary indoor baths with tiled floors and fire-heated water. Hair was trimmed in the tonsure style, shaved at the crown, long at the edges to signify religious humility. Feet were washed ceremonially on certain feast days, echoing Christ's washing of the disciples' feet. For nuns, cleanliness followed similar lines, but like all women in the Middle Ages, their hygiene rituals were closely tied to modesty. Bathing had to be done in privacy. Bodily maintenance, such as menstrual care, was a quiet and concealed practice. In both cases, bodily cleanliness was never just physical. It was tied to the soul. Women and hidden hygiene. For medieval women, especially peasants, hygiene was a burden carried quietly and constantly. They were expected to keep their households clean, launder clothes, manage waste, and tend to children's bodies. But their own needs were often secondary. Bathing was rare, soap expensive, clean linens a mark of pride and labor. Menstruation was managed using folded rags, moss, or scraps of cloth. There were no public discussions about it, no medical guidance, no products. Women passed on knowledge orally, mother to daughter, midwife to bride. Some women used herbal washes to manage odor or inflammation. Marigold for infection, yarrow for pain, mint for freshness. In wealthier households, women might possess small pots of rosewater, vinegar, or powdered chalk to freshen the skin. Cleanliness was part of a woman's virtue, yet the means to achieve it were scarce. And if she failed to appear clean or presentable, especially in town, she risked social judgment. Thus, the weight of hygiene fell unequally across gender as well as class. Children and clean slates. Children in the medieval world were dirty, and that was normal. Infants were wrapped in swaddling bands and rarely bathed. Diapers, when used, were made from cloth and cleaned sparingly. Children played barefoot, rolled in dirt, and shared bedding with siblings, animals, and bugs. But they were not neglected. Mothers and grandmothers combed their hair, washed their faces, and taught them the basics of grooming. Combs were precious objects, often made of bone or horn. A child's first haircut was often a notable moment, a transition toward adulthood, marked with care and even celebration. Children were also the first to suffer in poor hygienic conditions. They succumbed quickly to illness, diarrhea, or skin infections. As a result, their care was more attentive than we might assume. Cleanliness was an act of love, within the limits of what was possible. The public performance of cleanliness. In towns, cleanliness took on a public dimension. Barber surgeons offered grooming services, haircuts, beard trims, and minor surgery. Some doubled as bath attendants. A man who kept his beard oiled and neatly trimmed, or a woman whose hair was braided and clean, was seen as respectable. Merchants and skilled tradesmen were expected to appear clean before customers. Guilds sometimes enforced grooming standards as part of their codes of conduct. Yet in a world without indoor plumbing, clean was relative. Towns had public fountains or cisterns, but these could be polluted. Alleyways doubled as drains. Waste from upper floors poured down into the streets. Chamber pots were emptied from windows. The very act of walking to market required stepping over filth. So townspeople developed strategies: wooden clogs, ankle-length cloaks, perfumed sachets, and walking sticks to test the ground. One might leave home clean, but rarely arrived that way. Disease, blame, and the rise of fear. As Europe confronted waves of disease, plague, dysentery, and influenza, hygiene became a moral issue. People blamed filth, but also sin. Dirty bodies were linked with dirty souls. Public health became entangled with judgment. Some towns tried to regulate cleanliness, fining residents for throwing waste into the streets, mandating the cleaning of latrines, or requiring that bathhouses be closed during outbreaks. But these were reactive, not preventive. Germ theory was centuries away. And as epidemics raged, people began to fear contact with others. Avoiding bathhouses, crowds, or even shared cloths became a survival tactic. Cleanliness became not just comfort but protection. The itch of reputation. At every level of society, people were aware of how they were seen and smelled. A peasant girl wearing a clean apron and a ribbon in her hair might earn compliments from the village. A merchant with trimmed nails and combed hair might gain the trust of a buyer. A monk who smelled of incense and not sweat commanded more reverence. To be perceived as clean even marginally was to be perceived as worthy. But the itch remained. It lingered beneath the linen. It crawled under the collar. It scratched at the boundary between person and perception. And even when the body was clean, the idea of uncleanliness clung to the medieval mind. So we're left to wonder. In a world without mirrors, without daily showers, and without deodorant, what did it really mean to feel clean? We've explored the daily struggle, social meanings, and adaptations of medieval hygiene, But what does it all mean in the grand sweep of history? How did centuries of rough washing, community bathing, and itching influence the way we view cleanliness today? This final section brings the story full circle, following how medieval hygiene practices survived, evolved, or were deliberately forgotten, and how the values embedded in them, effort, humility, endurance, quietly linger in our modern rituals, long after the straw bedding and bone combs have vanished. The fall of the bathhouse. In the earlier Middle Ages, public bathhouses were common across many European towns. Their popularity, especially from the 12th to 14th centuries, might surprise modern assumptions about medieval filth. But these institutions began to decline sharply by the late 15th century. Why? In part, it was due to moral anxieties. As bathhouses became associated with sexual activity and sin, especially in urban centers, religious authorities pushed for their closure. The growing influence of Christian purity teachings cast nudity, even in hygienic contexts, as suspect. More importantly, plague changed everything. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, and its repeated resurgences made people suspicious of communal water. Instead of health, baths began to symbolize vulnerability. Some believed that bathing opened the pores and made the body susceptible to disease. Bathing fell out of fashion, especially full-body immersion. Instead, dry washing with cloths, scented powders, and vinegar-soaked rags became popular. In some regions, people began to believe that staying dirty helped protect them. In a strange twist of history, fear of disease increased uncleanliness. The Renaissance of odor. With the decline of bathing, the early modern period saw a rise in masking smells rather than removing them. Perfume became a booming industry, especially in places like France and Italy. Nobles wore scented gloves, sprayed their undergarments, and carried pomanders filled with aromatic resins. Rooms were fumigated with incense. Clothing was dusted with orris root and crushed petals. It wasn't that people no longer valued cleanliness, it was that they redefined it. Cleanliness became associated with the absence of odor, not the presence of water. Interestingly, even physicians joined this trend. Some advised patients to avoid bathing during illness, instead recommending dry rubs and aromatics. The association between health and visible cleanliness weakened, at least temporarily. Rural life, constant itch. While elites in cities powdered their wigs and carried perfumed handkerchiefs, rural peasants carried on as they had for centuries. Washing in rivers or heated tubs persisted where it was practical. Linen underclothes remained a staple of hygiene. Laundry was still a laborious ritual, often done communally at streams or in public wash houses. And yes, lice, fleas, and itches remained constant companions. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries, with industrial soap production and plumbing innovations, that true transformation began. But even then, many rural communities clung to older practices. Tradition endured, long past the arrival of modern cleanliness. The Enlightenment and scientific cleanliness. With the Enlightenment came a shift. Cleanliness began to be seen not only as a moral or aesthetic choice, but as scientific necessity. Advances in medicine and chemistry slowly revealed the connection between hygiene and disease. Though germ theory wouldn't be formalized until the 19th century, physicians and reformers began advocating more frequent bathing, improved sanitation, and public health measures. Hospitals were cleaned more rigorously. Urban infrastructure began to include sewers and piped water. Soap became cheaper, standardized, and widely advertised. Personal cleanliness, once a seasonal labor or symbolic performance, was on its way to becoming a daily ritual. And yet, echoes of the medieval mindset remained. Rituals that linger. Some of our modern habits have deep roots in medieval necessity. Brushing hair before bed, Not only aesthetic, this was once a form of lice control. Washing hands before meals, a ritualized habit in monasteries that became a universal expectation. Scented homes, we burned candles and used diffusers echoes of medieval strewn herbs and incense. Clean sheets as a marker of comfort. Then as now, clean bedding was a sign of care and status. Baths as luxury. Spa culture today mirrors Roman and medieval bathing traditions with warmth, scent, and quiet reflection. We rarely notice these links, but they surround us. The itch that remains. For all our progress, the itch remains psychological if not physical. Cleanliness today is not just medical, it is cultural. We equate it with responsibility, respectability, and order. To be clean is to be ready. To be dirty is to be lazy, careless, or unwell. But the medieval world complicates that view. Their cleanliness was hard. It required strength, effort, coordination, and often pain. It wasn't always achievable, and failure wasn't moral but circumstantial. Understanding this softens the harshness of modern judgment. It reminds us that to scratch, to struggle, to try is human, and that our ancestors lived full, dignified lives even while surrounded by the grime of necessity. So when we think of medieval hygiene, we might ask, was it really dirty, or was it simply human? Story 3. Heating the Unheatable Castle. If you ever found yourself wandering the great halls of a medieval castle, you might be tempted to imagine a roaring fire, crackling cheerfully in a grand hearth, warming tapestries and shining off armored knights. But that picture, romantic, golden, and warm, is misleading. Medieval castles were cold. They were meant to be cold. Designed for defense, not comfort, these fortresses of stone trapped damp air, echoed footsteps, and resisted heat with the same resolve they resisted invaders. Even as the nobility surrounded themselves with symbols of wealth and power, they still shivered beneath layers of wool and fur, seeking out the rare and flickering warmth of fire. This section begins our exploration of how castles were heated, or rather, how they failed to be, revealing the ingenuity, limitations, and daily endurance of life lived within cold stone walls. Castles, fortresses first, homes second. The first thing to understand is that medieval castles weren't built with comfort in mind. From the 11th through 13th centuries, most European castles prioritized defense. High towers, thick walls, narrow windows, moats, and drawbridges. These features were ideal for withstanding siege, but terrible for warmth. Stone walls, often several feet thick, absorbed and held cold. In winter, they became icy monoliths that chilled the very air. In summer, they offered some relief but never coziness. Windows were few and small, minimizing heat loss and air entry, but they also let in little sunlight. There was no insulation, no central heating, no double glazing, no understanding of thermodynamics. Heat, when generated, escaped almost immediately. Castles were proud structures, but they were, at their core, glorified stone refrigerators. The heart of the hall. Despite their limitations, castles did have fires. The most important was the great hearth, usually located in the main hall. This large open fire, often set directly in the center of the floor or against one wall, provided essential warmth and light. It was also the heart of social life. Nobles dined near it, entertained guests, and held court within its flickering glow. The fire was maintained by servants or kitchen staff, requiring a constant supply of logs, often hardwoods like oak or ash. Smoke escaped through a chimney, or in older halls, a simple hole in the roof called a louver. Even with chimneys, rooms often filled with smoke. Soot blackened the beams. Eyes stung, but warmth was worth the discomfort. The heat, however, had limitations. It radiated only a few feet. Guests seated farther from the fire, especially women and children, remained chilled. People shifted seats frequently, rotating like human sundials to catch the warmth. And when the fire died down, the cold crept in again. Tapestries, wool, and layers. Since heating the castle was inefficient, insulation became personal. Tapestries, often rich with color and design, were not just decorative, they were practical. Hung on walls, they blocked drafts and provided a barrier between the cold stone and the body. In wealthier castles, entire rooms were lined with woolen or velvet fabric. These wall hangings were so vital that they were often moved from residence to residence along with their owners. Clothing, too, became armor against the cold. Even indoors, nobles wore multiple layers: linen undershirts, woolen tunics, fur-lined cloaks. Gloves, hoods, and hats were common. Women wrapped themselves in shawls and wimples. Children, especially, were bundled heavily. Beds were the other defense. Four-poster beds with thick drapes could trap body heat, forming a tent-like microclimate. Within, mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. Blankets woven from heavy cloth or fur were layered thickly. In some cases, beds even had built-in warming pans, metal trays filled with hot coals, slid between sheets before sleep. Yet despite these efforts, people often went to bed cold and woke up colder. Fires beyond the hall. Larger castles eventually added more fireplaces in private chambers, guest rooms, and kitchens. But this was a slow innovation, appearing mostly in the later medieval period, 14th–15th centuries. Early fireplaces were simple: stone boxes with hoods to direct smoke. Chimneys were rare and poorly designed. Many flues smoked back into the room. Servants kept the fires burning with damp wood, peat, or dried dung. Even in noble rooms, a weak fire often did little more than warm your knees. The kitchen, usually separate from the living quarters to reduce fire risk, was the warmest room in any castle. Large hearths here burned constantly to prepare meals. Servants might huddle near the ovens while they worked, rubbing frozen fingers and rotating pots. But heat, like food, followed a hierarchy. The lord and lady got the warmest seats, guests next, servants last. The cold routine. Everyone, regardless of status, adapted to the cold. Chamber pots were used to avoid cold walks to the guardrobe, toilet, often located in distant turrets or stone outbuildings. Hand washing was minimal in winter. Water froze in basins. Washing was limited to the face and hands, often with cold water or none at all. Sleeping caps were worn to keep heads warm at night, essential in drafty towers. Foot warmers filled with coals were placed under banquet tables. Dogs and cats were welcome bedfellows, not just for companionship but for warmth. Still, winters were hard. There are records of ink freezing in inkwells, of wine turning solid in cups, of noblemen hosting feasts in halls so cold that guests ate in gloves and cloaks. To live in a castle was to live in a fortress, not a home, and winter reminded everyone of that. Fire as danger. As much as castles depended on fire for heat, fire was also a constant threat. Stone doesn't burn, but everything inside it does. Roofs, rafters, beds, tapestries, furniture, all were combustible. A spark from an untended hearth, a candle knocked over, a gust of wind through a wooden door, any of these could start a devastating blaze. Entire castle wings burned this way. Records from France and England speak of noble families fleeing in the night, cloaks over their heads, watching their home burn. As a result, some castles forbade fires in upper chambers or restricted candle use. In many cases, fires were doused after nightfall. Cold was the safer option. So then, as the nobleman stirred the fire and watched it sputter, he might have wondered, could a castle ever be truly warm, or was its chill part of the price for safety and status? In the grand castles of the medieval world, warmth was never evenly distributed. Though the hearth glowed in the great hall, its heat, like most resources, was rationed by status. The further one moved from nobility, both in hierarchy and in physical space, the colder life became. But the desire for warmth transcended class. Everyone, from highborn lords to lowly scullions, had to contend with the unrelenting chill of stone walls and open courtyards. This section explores how people through labor, invention, and sheer adaptation fought back against the cold, one smoky fire at a time. The castle as a hierarchy of heat. The medieval castle was structured vertically in more ways than one. At the top, literally and figuratively, were the private chambers of the lord and lady. These might include a fireplace later in the period, a canopy bed with thick drapes, and the service of attendants who kept the fire lit and fetched warmed stones for bedding. Even so, these chambers were often poorly insulated. Thick tapestries covered the walls, and carpets or rushes were laid on floors to soften the cold. Windows, if glazed, offered marginal insulation. If unglazed, they were covered with oiled cloth, wooden shutters, or even horn panes, translucent but not transparent. Below them, figuratively and physically, were the chambers of lesser nobles, guests, and clerics. These rooms might lack fireplaces and relied on proximity to warmed spaces or heavy bedding. At the bottom, often literally in the lower levels or servant wings, were the sleeping quarters of the staff. These were the coldest, darkest, and dampest parts of the castle. Often windowless and unheated, these quarters were warmed only by the collective body heat of their occupants and the thin walls that separated them from kitchens or stables. Warmth, like nobility, was inherited or assigned, not earned. The wood problem. Keeping a castle warm, even briefly, required astonishing quantities of fuel. Wood had to be chopped, hauled, seasoned, and stored. A single large hearth could burn through a cartload of logs in a matter of days. If multiple fireplaces were in use, especially in winter, the demand multiplied quickly. Forests surrounding castles were often carefully managed. Some lords established woodland ordinances to prevent overharvesting, and gamekeepers were tasked with monitoring both fuel collection and poaching. Peasants on nearby estates might be granted gleaning, rights to gather fallen branches, but cutting live wood without permission was punishable. As a result, fuel became a quiet currency. It was doled out by stewards, counted by the cord, and rationed for special guests. Servants were often cold not because wood was unavailable, but because they were not considered worth the fire. In castles far from forests or during sieges, wood shortages became acute. In such cases, alternate fuels were used: peat bricks, dried dung, or even straw bundles. These burned poorly and smoked heavily but provided at least some warmth. Kitchens, the hidden hearth. Though the Lord's Hall may have housed the symbolic fire, the kitchen held the true heat. Castle kitchens were vast, bustling spaces located in separate wings or even separate buildings. This design prevented the risk of fire spreading to the main structure, but it also meant that the cooks, scullions, and kitchen boys worked in relative warmth. Massive hearths lined the walls. Multiple fires burned simultaneously for boiling, roasting, baking, and stewing. Stone ovens retained heat throughout the day. Cauldrons of soup or pottage simmered endlessly. Spits turned before the flames, often by hand or using a turnspit dog on a wheel. The air was hot, greasy, and filled with smoke, but for the staff, it was a haven. Cooks were among the few in the castle who might go unchilled during a hard winter. Some servants, particularly in frigid months, volunteered for kitchen duties simply to escape the cold of their own quarters. Heated floors, early innovations. As castles evolved in the later Middle Ages, so too did heating technology, though only in wealthier regions. In certain castles in Normandy, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, a hypocaust system was occasionally employed, a method borrowed from Roman architecture. This involved heating floors from below by directing hot air from a furnace through flues under raised flooring. These systems were rare, expensive, and difficult to maintain. They required constant fuel and dedicated staff. Still, for the most elite, the possibility of warm feet in winter was worth the cost. Another innovation was the tiled stove, or Kachelofen, common in Germanic castles and cities by the 15th century. These ceramic stoves radiated heat for hours after the fire had gone out and emitted far less smoke than open hearths. But such technologies were unevenly spread and largely reserved for the elite. Most castle dwellers, even into the Renaissance, continued to rely on the same primitive methods: open fire, layered clothing, and hope. Laboring in the cold. While lords might complain of chilly chambers, the castle's daily laborers contended with far worse. Stable hands began their days before dawn, feeding and grooming horses in freezing stalls. Laundresses washed clothing in icy basins, beating cloth against stones with raw, red hands. Guards paced atop battlements, cloaks wrapped tightly, eyes watering from the wind. Blacksmiths, carpenters, gardeners, and masons all worked outdoors or in unheated spaces. For these individuals, warmth came not from fire but from movement. Labor heated the body. Bread, beer, and porridge refueled it. Pauses meant freezing. Servants sometimes kept hot stones or bricks in cloth pouches, warming their beds or placing them in boots. Others tucked straw inside tunics for added insulation. None of it was enough. The scent of cold. Castle air was not clean. Fires, especially in poorly ventilated rooms, produced smoke and soot. Chimneys were often narrow, and drafty rooms caused fires to belch smoke unpredictably. Tapestries absorbed this smell. Clothing became smoky. Hair reeked of burnt oak or peat. Yet even this was preferable to cold. Some castle occupants reported coughing fits, teary eyes, and soot-lined nostrils. Still, no one opened the shutters, not in January. The cold was ever present, but so was the smoke. People lived in a gray fog of discomfort. Dreams of heat. And yet, despite the struggle, people adapted. They gathered closer to fires. They wore more wool. They developed routines, warming the bed before sleep, pressing clothes near embers, wrapping hands around mugs of mulled wine. A warm fire was not just comfort, it was status. To be near it was to be important. To control it was to be powerful. And so the fire glowed, night after night, amid the dark stones of Europe's great castles. But still we must ask, could warmth ever be anything more than a fleeting luxury in such unyielding walls? Or was cold simply the cost of power? In a world before insulation, thermostats, or even glass windows, the medieval castle stood firm not as a sanctuary of warmth, but as a symbol of control, strength, and often discomfort. The great halls may have roared with firelight, but their chill remained deeply embedded in the stone. This final section traces how the cold of the castle shaped not just architecture, but culture, behavior, and memory. It was not simply a feature of place, it was an experience that left a lasting mark on the people who lived within those walls. The castle in winter, an annual ordeal. As the autumn leaves fell and winter took hold, castle life slowed. Campaigning armies retreated. Roads became impassable with mud or snow. Trade thinned. Life drew inward, and the entire structure turned into a fortress not just against enemies, but against the cold. Food stores were sealed. Animals were moved into covered stalls or outbuildings. Windows were shuttered with thick planks or cloth. Extra rushes or straw were laid on the floors, and woolen hangings were brought out from storage. For some nobles, this meant retreating to a smaller, more manageable residence, a manor house, or a hunting lodge where fewer fires were needed to maintain warmth. For others, it meant consolidating household staff into fewer rooms, minimizing movement, and trying to wait out the worst of the season. Servants spent hours hauling wood, managing fires, drying clothing, and rotating rushes to prevent mold. And the cold still came through. Social life around the fire. Despite discomfort, fire brought people together. In the great hall, nobles gathered near the central hearth in the evenings. This space was more than just a warming station, it was a theater of power. The lord's seat was closest to the fire. Guests and courtiers sat in descending rank, both in distance and importance. Musicians, storytellers, and jesters performed here. Meals were served hot, if only to momentarily chase away the chill. But as soon as the fire waned, so did activity. In a culture without artificial lighting, night was for sleeping, not lingering. After supper, most of the castle went dark. Those lucky enough to sleep in a chamber with a fireplace had it lit briefly. Others climbed into their beds, fully clothed, sometimes even wearing boots, with dogs curled beside them for extra warmth. The day began and ended with fire and its absence. The cold's cultural imprint. Centuries of living with the cold shaped more than just habits. It shaped mindsets. Silence in winter was common. Thick walls muffled sounds. People spoke less to preserve energy. Laborers focused on indoor tasks, repairing gear, spinning wool, mending tools. Winter was a season for patience and conservation. Festivals like Christmas and Twelfth Night often centered around food and fire. Feasting and merriment were not just traditions, they were strategies to bring warmth, physically and emotionally. Fire became a symbol of abundance in a season of scarcity. Even religious ceremonies acknowledged the hardship of cold. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, involved the blessing of candles, literal beacons of light in the darkest time of year. Death increased in winter. Cold-related illness, accidents, or malnutrition were common causes. Castle chapels often recorded higher numbers of masses for the dead in the early months of the year. The enduring cold of power. Noble status didn't exempt one from the chill, it simply gave you better options to endure it. But perhaps, more deeply, it revealed the illusion of control. Castles so imposing from the outside offered limited mastery over nature. Wind still whistled through arrow slits. Ice still formed on inner walls. Food still froze. Children still died of cold-related fevers. The warmth of power was, in many ways, metaphorical. And so nobles learned to endure alongside servants. They became practiced in stoicism, wrapped in silence, waiting for the thaw. A lord might sleep in a velvet-draped bed, but he still slept in a room where the basin water turned solid by morning. Perhaps this shared hardship, endured across ranks, offered a rare point of unity in a divided world. The castle's cold legacy. As the medieval period ended and the Renaissance rose, castles began to change. Fireplaces improved, chimneys were widened and vented better, glazing of windows became more common, and the advent of coal as a fuel offered longer, hotter burns. But the true revolution came with architecture. By the 16th and 17th centuries, manor houses and palaces replaced castles as preferred noble dwellings. These newer homes emphasized comfort and aesthetics. Defensive walls gave way to open gardens and large windows. And warmth finally became an expectation, not a luxury. Still, the memory of the cold remained embedded in European folklore, literature, and even architecture. Grand fireplaces, even today, echo the old hearths. Holiday traditions gathering by fire, sharing warm drinks, telling winter tales are all inheritances of a time when the cold ruled the stone. A final reflection. The medieval castle, for all its grandeur, never mastered heat. Its fires flickered briefly. Its walls breathed frost. Its occupants layered wool and whispered in the dark. But within that cold, people adapted. They endured, invented, and turned hardship into ritual. And in doing so, they created not just shelter but culture. So the next time you stand by a heater, light a fire, or pull a blanket tighter on a winter's night, remember. We once lived in castles, but they didn't keep us warm, we kept each other warm. Story 4. Eating medieval meals without a table fork. In a world without table manners as we know them, and without a familiar array of cutlery, the medieval meal was a different experience, one of shared space, coarse textures, loud rooms, and hands that did much of the work. It was social, messy, occasionally uncomfortable, and absolutely central to daily life. This story begins with the humble meal and the strange reality that for much of the Middle Ages, the fork so essential to modern etiquette was not only absent, it was often distrusted. Food was eaten with hands, spoons, or knives, and yet this lack of utensil did not mean a lack of structure. On the contrary, meals were deeply ceremonial, and how you ate reflected who you were. Let us sit down at the long wooden table and explore how meals unfolded in medieval homes, castles, and halls without forks, napkins, or plates as we know them. No forks at the table. To begin with, it must be said plainly, the table fork in medieval Europe was a scandal. Though the fork existed in parts of the Byzantine Empire by the 10th century, and in Islamic cultures even earlier, it was slow to arrive in Western Europe. When it did appear, it was often associated with foreign customs or excessive luxury. The idea of spearing food with a metal prong was considered strange, even decadent. In 1004, when the Venetian princess Maria Argyropulina used a fork at her wedding feast, observers condemned it as effeminate and impious. Her early death was seen by some as divine punishment for using such an unholy implement. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that forks became common in Europe. In the 12th century, during the height of the medieval period, you ate with your hands and perhaps a knife or a spoon, if you had one. The knife, tool of table and belt. The knife was the primary eating implement, and every man was expected to carry one on his belt, alongside his pouch, and sometimes a spoon. These knives were personal items, not set at the table for communal use. A guest might offer a knife to another as a courtesy, but it was not assumed. Knives were used to slice meat into manageable chunks, scoop soft foods alongside bread, pick at roasted vegetables or fish, spread butter or soft cheese. Tables in great halls or modest homes were rarely set with full cutlery. Instead, people carved from shared platters, passed bowls, and pulled pieces apart by hand. The lack of a fork didn't mean lack of etiquette. There were rules, especially in noble households. You weren't to bite directly into shared food. You weren't to wipe greasy fingers on your tunic. You were to serve others before yourself, and to keep your sleeves out of the dishes. These manners were taught early and enforced by social pressure, not napkins. The spoon, a quiet companion. Spoons were more common than forks, but still not universal. Made from wood, horn, or pewter in wealthier homes, they were used for soups, stews, pottage, and gruel, all staples of the medieval diet. Like knives, they were often brought to the table by the individual. A spoon was a personal possession, sometimes carved with initials or decorative handles. If lost, it wasn't easily replaced. Some households provided communal spoons, especially in monasteries or inns, but many people preferred their own. Children inherited them, travelers packed them, and those who lacked one simply drank from the bowl. In daily meals, spoons were most often used for thick vegetable pottage, oatmeal or barley porridge, soft cheese or custard, broths with floating grains or scraps. Spoons, like bowls, were licked clean. Bread as plate and utensil. Perhaps the most fascinating utensil of the medieval meal was bread, or rather, the trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread, usually several days old, used as a plate. Onto this edible dish went meats, vegetables, and sauces. As the meal progressed, the trencher soaked up juices and softened. A person might eat their trencher, offer it to a servant, or give it to the poor. In wealthier households, trenchers were changed between courses. In humbler homes, there was just one, and it did its duty until it crumbled. Bread was also used for scooping. Diners pinched bits of soft food with crusts or swiped their trencher through sauces. Nothing went to waste. Even crumbs were swept into a communal bowl, often fed to animals or beggars later. Bread was utensil, plate, and sponge. Meals were shared, not private. Unlike modern dining, where meals often take place on individualized plates, medieval eating was communal. Dishes were placed at intervals along long tables. Each pair of diners typically shared one bowl or platter, sometimes more. You reached in together. You served each other. You ate from the same space. This had implications for hygiene. Before eating, it was expected that hands be washed, especially the right hand, which did most of the serving and touching. Wealthier tables offered finger bowls or cloths for cleaning. Poorer homes might use a shared basin and towel. Sharing food also enforced social bonds. To break bread with someone was to acknowledge their dignity and your relationship. Sharing salt, in particular, was a symbolic act of hospitality and trust. And so etiquette demanded care. You were not to double dip. You were not to sniff at shared bowls. You were to behave with restraint, even if your belly ached with hunger. The lack of forks did not permit savagery, it demanded cooperation. The grit in the meal. For all their rules and customs, medieval meals could be gritty, literally. Flour was ground in stone mills. As a result, fine dust from millstones ended up in the bread. Over time, this stone grit wore down teeth, especially molars. Archaeologists studying medieval skulls often find flattened or cracked teeth, evidence of a lifetime chewing gritty bread. This tooth wear affected even the upper classes. Fancy pastries and imported sweets did not replace bread as the staple of life. Grit also came from unwashed vegetables still holding sand, cooking pots with residue from fires, storage bins with rodent contamination, meat roasted over ashes with bits of charcoal. No meal was sterile, and yet people survived resilient and adjusted to the textures of their time. Eating was loud, warm, and alive. Meals weren't quiet affairs. Halls echoed with voices, the clatter of spoons in bowls, laughter, the occasional bark of a dog waiting under the table. In a castle or monastery, hundreds might dine at once. In a cottage, family members elbowed for space around a rough plank table. Meals brought warmth in food, in firelight, and in the closeness of shared company. People ate heartily, fingers slick with fat, lips stained by berries, teeth stained by wine or soot. A shared jug of ale passed hand to hand. A crust of bread wiped clean a dish. Then more food, more stories, another ladle of pottage. This was dining without distance, intimate, earthy, communal. So we returned to the table and asked, if a fork wasn't needed to enjoy a meal, then what changed? What made the fork not only acceptable but necessary? Though medieval meals were communal and grounded in practicality, they were far from informal. In castles, monasteries, and even some wealthier homes, eating became an opportunity to reinforce hierarchy, etiquette, and religious values, all without the fork. This section explores how meals were orchestrated events. They followed rhythms and expectations rooted in centuries of custom, influenced by class, faith, and the unspoken rules of place. Though the hand was still the dominant eating tool, the act of dining became increasingly symbolic. Meals as performance. In noble and royal households, a meal was not simply food, it was theater. Great halls were stages. Guests entered in prescribed order. Servants bustled between benches, pouring wine and delivering platters. Minstrels played lutes. Trumpeters heralded the arrival of the Lord. Grace was said. Candles flickered. Even the act of carving meat became ceremonial. A designated server, the carver, had to be trained. Carving a joint of meat was done with elegance, often standing, using precise motions. It was a public skill, part display, part duty. Carvers sliced for the Lord and his guests first, then passed plates down the table. Forks were absent, but structure reigned. Seating was arranged by status. Conversation was monitored. Manners mattered. A guest who reached across the table, chewed with an open mouth, or spoke too loudly could earn a lifetime of ridicule. In short, you could eat with your hands and still be judged for lacking refinement. The liturgical table, monastic meals. In monasteries, meals followed the divine office, the cycle of daily prayers that shaped every monastic hour. Meals were quiet, sometimes silent. Monks sat in long rows facing each other with a reader standing in the center, reciting scripture or lives of the saints. Talk was forbidden. Food was modest, usually vegetables, bread, cheese, and sometimes fish. Wine or weak ale was permitted. Everything had a place. Dishes were placed evenly. Spoons were issued to each monk. Hands were washed before and after. Food not eaten was returned or distributed to the poor. The absence of forks didn't reflect a lack of discipline, but rather a focused simplicity. Monastic dining was about restraint. Even hunger was approached with humility. The rules extended to how much could be eaten, what days were meatless, often over half the year, and how to handle leftovers. Waste was frowned upon. Meals in the cloister were another kind of ritual spiritual nourishment shadowing the physical. The place of salt. Among all the items on the table, salt held unusual power. Salt was expensive, vital for preserving food and symbolic of purity. At feasts and meals, the placement of the salt dish, the saltcellar, reflected status. To sit above the salt meant you were near the Lord or the host. Below the salt placed you among lesser guests or servants. Sharing salt with someone signified trust, even alliance. Some oaths were sealed with salt. In legal disputes or feasting rituals, exchanging salt implied goodwill. To spill it was bad luck. The phrase still echoes today, though its origins are largely forgotten. In a world without refrigeration, salt was life. On the medieval table, it was also diplomacy. The role of servers and cupbearers. Every table had structure behind it, an invisible engine of servants, pages, cupbearers, and cooks. A server's duties included tasting the food before it reached the Lord, a holdover from fears of poisoning; washing hands of guests, pouring water from jugs into basins before and after the meal; serving wine, often in a strict order of rank; managing courses, sometimes 5 or 6 per meal, each with different dishes. Though utensils were minimal, formality was not. Napkins were folded into specific shapes. Towels were offered to higher-ranking guests. Bowls of rosewater were used for perfuming hands. The cupbearer, often a trusted youth or squire, had a highly respected role, both ceremonial and practical. They handed the Lord his wine, often after tasting it themselves, and stood by during the meal. In royal courts, the cupbearer's role could be political, given only to those of noble birth. All of this pouring, carving, wiping, and washing happened in the absence of forks. Still, nothing felt primitive. The system worked, built over generations. The evolution of dishes and courses. Meals, especially among the wealthy, became increasingly complex in the later Middle Ages. The idea of courses emerged not in the modern sense of appetizer, entree, and dessert, but in rounds of dishes. A banquet might include a first course of boiled meats and stews, a second course of roasted game, sauces, and pies, a final course of candied fruits, cheese, and spiced wine. These dishes were brought out in large bowls or trays. Diners used their knives to portion, spoons to scoop, and hands to taste. Bread trenchers were still standard, but by the 15th century, wooden or pewter plates became more common, especially in wealthier homes. And yet the fork was still missing. Even with increasingly refined dishes, fig-stuffed pastries, sugar-glazed quails, or layered custards, people ate with practiced hands. Clean hands, clean conscience. Hand washing was vital. Before and after meals, ritual hand washing was observed, particularly in noble circles and monasteries. Servants poured water over guests, fingers from ewers into silver or ceramic basins. Towels were offered, often scented. Clean hands were not just practical, they were symbolic of honor, hospitality, and readiness. A host who failed to offer water was considered uncouth. In this world, where hands met food directly, hygiene and dignity overlapped. Guests were expected to come to the table clean, respectful, and ready to participate in a shared act of nourishment. Eating was physical, yes, but also moral. Hands as tools, hands as status. The hand in the Middle Ages was more than just a tool. It was a marker of class and labor. A lord's hand was soft, perfumed, manicured. A blacksmith's hand was cracked, blackened, powerful. A monk's hand was calloused by ink and prayer. A servant's hand was quick, careful, accustomed to heat and cold. To use your hands at the table was not primitive, it was human. But it was also revealing. You could tell who someone was by the way they ate, how they held a piece of bread, whether they offered it to others, how long they lingered, whether they wiped their fingers on the table or their sleeve. The table, even without forks, was a mirror of the world outside, full of hierarchy, cooperation, subtle judgment, and daily ritual. So as we step back from this hall, where spoons clink in bowls and hands tear bread, we ask, when did eating with hands begin to seem uncivilized, and what did we lose in that shift? By the end of the Middle Ages, European dining was on the cusp of transformation. New influences were arriving from abroad: finer cutlery, printed books of etiquette, and a growing obsession with cleanliness and social refinement. The fork, long scorned as foreign or effeminate, slowly crept back into the hall. This final section explores how the medieval table began to shift fork by fork, rule by rule, into something resembling the modern meal. But it also considers what was left behind: a more tactile, shared, and grounded experience of eating. The fork returns quietly. Though forks had appeared in the Byzantine Empire centuries earlier, they only began gaining a foothold in Western Europe during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, particularly in Italy. It was here that noble families, influenced by Eastern courts and luxury goods, began using two-pronged metal forks for eating sticky or delicate foods: candied fruits, soft cheese, sweetmeats. At first, it was more an ornament than a tool. Italian noblewomen were among the first consistent users. Caterina de' Medici, upon marrying into the French royal family in 1533, reportedly brought forks and new table manners with her. Over time, French aristocrats, initially skeptical, followed suit. In England, adoption came later. The English traveler Thomas Coriat was mocked in 1608 for using a fork upon his return from Italy. Effeminate curiosity, his critics called it. Yet within a few generations, the fork was not only common, it was expected. The etiquette movement. What truly pushed forks into mainstream use wasn't just international influence, it was the rise of etiquette literature. As printing became more affordable in the late medieval and early modern period, books on proper behavior began circulating widely. One of the most famous, Erasmus, De Civilitate Morum Puerium, on civility in children, 1530, laid out clear guidelines for table manners. Do not wipe your fingers on the tablecloth. Do not blow your nose with your hand. Do not place your bones back in the shared dish. Do not scratch yourself while eating. Such books, written first for noble youth and later for merchant families, emphasized cleanliness, restraint, and bodily control. The fork fit into this new ethos perfectly. It minimized hand contact with food. It implied refinement. It marked those who had learned not just how to eat but how to perform civility. Changes in food and presentation. By the 15th century, European food was also changing. Refined sugar became more available and affordable, leading to sticky desserts and fine confections. Pasta and noodles, often slippery, required more precise handling. Sauce dishes became more delicate, more layered, harder to manage with bread or fingers alone. Tablecloths became more elaborate and harder to wash, encouraging utensils to avoid stains. As the presentation of food evolved, so too did the need for utensils that separated food from fingers. The fork wasn't just a tool, it was a response to changing tastes, both literal and cultural. The last stronghold, peasant tables. While noble households and merchants slowly adopted forks, the rural peasant table remained largely unchanged. For the average family, knives and spoons still reigned. Bread trenchers were slowly replaced by wooden bowls or ceramic plates, but eating with hands remained the norm well into the 17th century in many areas. Why? Cost: forks were made of metal, sometimes silver. They were expensive. Custom: hands worked. The food was familiar. Why chain? Scarcity of delicate foods. Peasants ate porridge, bread, and stews easily eaten with spoons and fingers. And so, even as the upper classes embraced forks, much of Europe continued to dine as it had for centuries, shoulder to shoulder, spoon to bowl, hand to bread. The decline of the trencher. As the fork rose, the trencher fell. Plates became more common: wooden, ceramic, and eventually pewter. By the early modern period, trenchers survived mostly in symbolic form, for ceremonial feasts or as nods to tradition. Bread still held a central place at the table, but it was no longer used as a dish. Instead, it sat in baskets, served in slices, no longer required to hold meat or soak grease. What had once been an edible utensil became just food. A new kind of cleanliness. One of the ironies of the fork's rise is that it didn't actually make people cleaner, at least not at first. Hands were still used to cut, scoop, and tear. Shared dishes were still common, but the idea of cleanliness took center stage. The fork allowed people to appear more refined, to gesture without grease, to eat without chewing noises, to maintain distance not just from food but from others. It turned eating into something controlled rather than communal. And slowly meals became quieter, more individualized, less messy, less shared. The fork and the individual. Perhaps the most lasting change brought by the fork was its role in redefining the individual at the table. Instead of shared bowls, diners began receiving their own plates. Instead of reaching into dishes, food was passed or served by a host. Instead of direct contact, utensils mediated the relationship between person and meal. The fork, in a sense, helped create the modern diner, seated, measured, separated. It wasn't just about the food. It was about boundaries between people, between behaviors, between classes. Eating was no longer just an act, it was a statement. Final reflections. The medieval meal, eaten without forks, was a world of texture, sound, and togetherness. It involved every part of the body: eyes watching others, hands sharing dishes, voices overlapping. As the fork arrived, it brought refinement, but it also brought distance. And so we are left with a quiet question. In gaining polish at the table, did we lose something more essential, something communal, messy, and beautifully human? Story 5. Waste and sanitation in the Middle Ages. In our modern world, sanitation is invisible. You flush and the waste disappears. You turn on a tap and clean water flows. But in the medieval world, sanitation was not hidden. It was seen, smelled, and carried, often by hand. Waste didn't disappear. It stayed close, in courtyards, under floorboards, and in pots beside the bed. This is the story of how people in the Middle Ages managed the most basic, inescapable problem of human life: waste. Without sewage systems, toilets, or even running water, Communities across medieval Europe had to invent ways, some clever, some crude, to handle what was left behind after the meal, after the feast, or in the middle of the night. From chamber pots to cesspits, from monastic latrines to castle guardrobes, the solutions varied, but the challenges remained. This section begins in the most private of places, the medieval bedroom. The chamber pot, a necessary companion. Imagine it's the middle of a winter night. You're in a second-floor room of a drafty medieval home or castle. Outside, the wind howls, and the path to the outhouse is slippery, frozen, and pitch black. What do? You reach for the chamber pot. The chamber pot was a simple item, a bowl, usually of ceramic or pewter, sometimes of wood or even horn. It sat under the bed beside the fireplace or tucked into a cupboard. Everyone had one, peasants, nobles, monks. It was used during the night or when going outdoors was unsafe, inconvenient, or simply impossible. After use, the contents were emptied, but where? In a home with a yard, the waste might be dumped into a privy pit, a shallow hole dug for the purpose. In a town or castle, it might be thrown into a gutter, a courtyard drain, or over a wall. There were rules about this, but rules were often ignored. Guardes ello, mind the waste. In medieval towns, especially in dense urban centers like Paris or London, upper floors of homes jutted over narrow streets. Lacking indoor plumbing, residents used chamber pots during the night and emptied them by hand, sometimes out the window. To avoid accidents or lawsuits, the courteous thing was to shout "Guardes ello," watch out for the water, before tossing the contents. It was a warning not always followed and rarely enough. Waste hit passers-by, it pooled in alleys, it ran in gutters, it froze in winter, and it smelled always. Some towns had regulations about waste disposal. In 14th century London, for example, residents were fined for throwing filth, ordure, or other uncleanness into the streets, but enforcement was inconsistent. Waste management in cities was mostly reactive. When the smell grew too strong or disease too common, orders went out. Clean the streets, empty the cesspits, dig new trenches. But daily life continued amid the filth. The castle guardrobe. In castles, the solution to waste disposal had its own name, the guardrobe. This was a small room or recess, often built into the thickness of the castle wall or overhanging the moat. Inside was a stone or wooden bench with a hole in it. Waste dropped down a vertical shaft, sometimes directly into the moat, sometimes into a pit. Guardrobes were often placed in turrets, away from main living areas. Some castles had multiple guardrobes serving various chambers. Wealthier castles might have them adjacent to the lord's rooms, while others were shared among many. But there were problems. Odor, the smell traveled. There was little ventilation. Drafts in winter, cold air blew up the shaft. Blockages, waste sometimes accumulated, requiring manual removal. Servants handled maintenance. In some castles, small doors at the base of the shaft allowed access for cleaning. In others, waste simply collected in the moat. Ironically, these moats, thought of as defensive barriers, often became disease traps, filled with stagnant water and human waste. Monastic latrines, cleanliness as devotion. Monasteries had some of the best sanitation in medieval Europe. Guided by rules emphasizing order and cleanliness, monastic communities built communal latrines, often connected to a running water source. These latrines, sometimes called reredos, were long stone or wooden benches with holes, suspended over a drainage channel. Cistercian and Benedictine monasteries, in particular, developed advanced systems. Water diverted from nearby streams flushed waste away, reducing odors and contamination. Latrines were located near dormitories for ease of use, especially at night. Monks washed before and after use. Silence was maintained, and laborers were assigned to keep the facilities clean. This was not just about hygiene, it was about humility. Cleanliness of body mirrored cleanliness of soul. Yet even here, waste had to go somewhere. It flowed into ditches, fields, or rivers, sometimes contaminating water downstream. Rural privies and ditches. In the countryside, solutions were simple. Many peasants used latrine pits, shallow holes dug near the edge of their property. Covered by a wooden structure or simple boards, these privies offered basic shelter. When full, they were covered with earth and a new pit dug nearby. Others relieved themselves in fields, hedgerows, or streams. This was not always by choice. Poverty, illness, or distance made it necessary. Farmers sometimes used waste as fertilizer, mixing human excrement with straw or animal dung. This practice, called night soil, was common, though risky. The connection between waste and disease was not fully understood, but people knew that too much filth led to illness. Still, in an age of survival, everything was used. Waste was not waste, it was fuel for the next harvest. Public facilities, rare but real. Some medieval towns had public latrines, especially near markets or city gates. These were basic structures, shared benches over pits, sometimes with running water. They were often gender segregated, sometimes manned by attendants who cleaned them and collected fees. But public toilets were rare, underfunded, and often neglected. Their upkeep depended on local authorities, guilds, or private donors. When they broke, they stayed broken. Even in places like Rome or London, most residents used chamber pots. Public facilities were a luxury. The smell of everyday life. One cannot overstate this. Medieval towns smelled. Tanneries dumped animal waste. Butchers spilled blood into streets. Fishmongers left piles of offal. Human waste mingled with horse dung, rotting food, and ash. In summer, the stench intensified. In winter, it froze only to return. People grew accustomed to it. They burned herbs, incense, and aromatic woods to mask odors. Nobles carried pomanders, perfumed balls. Churches swung censers of sweet-smelling smoke. Still, the smell lingered. There were no garbage trucks, no sewers, no janitorial services. Sanitation was personal, local, and limited. So as you imagine life in the Middle Ages, from lord's chamber to peasant's hut, ask, how close would you have lived to your own waste, and what would that have meant for your sense of privacy, dignity, and health? The medieval world was filled with ingenuity, especially when necessity demanded it. Though most people lived in close proximity to their waste, that didn't mean they ignored its dangers. Where the mess grew too large, a quiet army of laborers, rules, and early infrastructure emerged to manage what others left behind. In this section, we look beyond the chamber pot and privy to the world of waste removal. The people who did it, the rules that governed it, and the small, surprising innovations that shaped the earliest forms of urban sanitation. The gong farmer, one of the dirtiest jobs in history. Among the most reviled and underappreciated workers of the medieval world was the gong farmer, a person tasked with cleaning out cesspits and privy vaults. Gong was an Old English word for both going, as in to the toilet, and the waste itself. Gong farmers, mostly operating in towns and cities, were responsible for descending into deep pits filled with human excrement, sometimes up to their waists, to shovel out the accumulated waste. Their tools were simple: a long-handled shovel or scoop, buckets or carts for carrying waste, ropes and pulleys to raise containers from deep shafts. Work was done at night, partly to avoid the smell disrupting daily life, but also because the presence of human waste in public areas during the day was socially unacceptable. The collected waste was often taken outside city walls and sold as fertilizer to farmers, contributing to the urban economy in a quietly essential way. The job paid relatively well due to its extreme unpleasantness, but social status for gong farmers remained low. They were banned from certain places, denied apprenticeships in other trades, and occasionally even forced to live outside city limits. Still, without them, cities would have drowned in their own filth. Cesspits and their maintenance. Urban homes without access to running water relied on cesspits, underground chambers lined with stone, brick, or sometimes nothing at all. These pits collected waste from chamber pots, privies, and even kitchen drains. When full, cesspits had to be emptied manually, often by gong farmers or hired laborers. The waste, thick and partially liquefied, was sometimes several feet deep. Workers descended by ladder or were lowered by rope, removing the material in buckets. Smells were unbearable. Gases trapped below could cause suffocation or explosions. Collapsing walls were not uncommon. Despite the risks, some cesspits were carefully engineered, with access panels, ventilation holes, or drains leading to stews, open-air settling pools. But most were ad hoc, patched together and prone to failure. Overflow from these pits seeped into streets, cellars, and even wells. And yet city life went on. Laws and bylaws, a struggle for order. Municipal authorities across medieval Europe attempted to regulate sanitation, with mixed success. In London, the Assize of Nuisance laws laid out clear instructions: no dumping waste in public streets, no constructing privies too close to neighbors' wells, and no blocking public drains. Offenders could be fined, ordered to clean up the mess, or have their properties seized. Similar laws existed in Paris, Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck, each trying to control the spread of filth as cities expanded. Some towns hired official inspectors who patrolled streets to check for waste violations. Others appointed scavengers to oversee cleanup. But enforcement was sporadic, corruption was common, and during times of famine, war, or plague, these concerns fell away entirely. In reality, sanitation was only as good as the people who lived there and their willingness to cooperate. Rivers as sewers. Wherever possible, cities built near rivers or streams used them as natural disposal systems. Waste from homes, latrines, and public bathhouses was funneled into nearby waterways. Ditches lined with stone or wood channeled material through streets and into the nearest current. This practice had obvious consequences. Upstream-downstream dynamics mattered. The rich often lived upstream with cleaner water, the poor downstream with water already tainted. Fish stocks declined in polluted rivers. Disease spread rapidly through contaminated water supplies. But without the concept of germs, many medieval people believed flowing water cleaned itself. Clarity was mistaken for cleanliness. In towns with watermills or breweries, competition for clean water sometimes led to legal disputes. One miller's waste dump could ruin another's grain wash. And still, the river carried it all away until it didn't. Early sewers and drainage channels. Some cities began to experiment with rudimentary sewers. The Cloaca Maxima of ancient Rome was long abandoned, but medieval engineers occasionally dug covered channels beneath streets. These weren't modern sewers, but stone-lined ditches, often with removable slabs on top. They carried rainwater, street runoff, and sometimes waste toward the river or a drainage field. Cities like Paris and London had open gutters known as kennels, running down the center or sides of streets. People were expected to sweep waste into these channels, where it was flushed by rain or swept by hand. But these systems were vulnerable. Blockages were frequent. Rats and vermin thrived. During droughts, nothing flowed. Over time, certain guilds and wealthier households built private drainage systems, a small but crucial step toward modern plumbing. Still, for most, waste flowed through open channels visible to all. Waste and disease, the invisible threat. Though medieval people didn't understand bacteria, they were keen observers. They noticed patterns. Filth brought sickness. During outbreaks, particularly the Black Death in the 14th century, waste became a focal point. Cities ordered mass cleanings. Waste pits were burned or covered. Public latrines were closed. Some believed bad air or miasma spread disease. This led to the use of herbs, flowers, and incense to purify the air. Others blamed moral decay, sin, and divine punishment. Still, a proto-scientific understanding emerged. Physicians began recommending cleaner streets, better food handling, and removal of stagnant water. Waste was no longer just a nuisance, it was feared. Rural sanitation, simpler but not safer. In the countryside, waste management was less visible but no less important. Manure from animals was collected and used as fertilizer. Human waste, too, was sometimes mixed in, though with care. The proximity of wells and waste pits could spell disaster. Diarrheal diseases were common, parasites too. Most villages had communal fields or designated ditches for dumping. Laws sometimes banned using latrines near wells or inside barns, but such rules were hard to enforce. And so, rural folk, though blessed with space, still faced challenges. Children played near latrine pits. Dogs dug into waste heaps. Food was prepared on wooden tables cleaned with cold water. There was no bleach, no gloves, no understanding of cross-contamination. So we must wonder, how did people, surrounded by filth and danger, continue to survive and even thrive in such environments? Was survival itself the proof of their unspoken knowledge and quiet resilience? Despite centuries of improvisation, labor, and fragile systems, the medieval world remained overwhelmingly unsanitary by modern standards. And yet people adapted. They endured, found ways to manage, and eventually began to seek something better, not only out of comfort, but necessity. In this final section, we explore how the experience of living with waste so close, so unavoidable, slowly evolved into reform, invention, and eventually, a new understanding of cleanliness and public health. But this transformation took time, and it began, as most things do, with what people could no longer ignore. The accumulation problem. Cesspits filled, privies overflowed, chamber pots cracked. In towns and cities, the sheer scale of waste eventually outpaced the old systems. By the 14th and 15th centuries, urban populations were growing. With more people came more waste, and with that, more disease, more complaints, and more urgent need for change. City authorities began issuing more strict sanitation orders. In Nuremberg, for instance, homeowners were fined for dumping waste into the streets. In Florence, tax funds were redirected to build and maintain drainage ditches. In London, laws prohibited building houses without some form of privy or cesspit. But these were still piecemeal solutions. Gong farmers, scavengers, and street cleaners remained the backbone of sanitation. They worked through the night, scraping human waste from alleys, hauling it through the gates, and dumping it far beyond the town walls. It was a temporary fix for a permanent problem. The transition toward closed systems. As wealth and trade increased in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, certain homes, especially those of merchants, doctors, and minor nobility, began adapting their architecture to include private waste systems. Privies were built over masonry shafts, which could be emptied without digging. Some homes constructed sloped drainage channels, leading to communal gutters. A few larger houses experimented with sealed waste containers buried in the courtyard. These weren't sewers, but they were steps toward containment. The first indoor toilets, however crude, began appearing in wealthier regions of northern Italy and France in the 15th and 16th centuries. Still, they relied on gravity and buckets, not plumbing. It would be centuries before anything like modern sanitation reached most people. But the idea of separation, of keeping waste away from water, food, and sleeping quarters was gaining ground. Changing attitudes, from acceptance to disgust. Perhaps the most important shift wasn't technological, but psychological. For much of the Middle Ages, people lived with waste in ways we now find unthinkable because they had no choice. Smells were constant, public urination was common, latrines were shared. But over time, as class boundaries hardened, religious values sharpened, and etiquette literature spread, people became more self-conscious. Books on civility advised against spitting indoors or relieving oneself in public. By the 16th century, manners guides began to explicitly discourage passing gas at the table or discussing bodily functions in polite company. A growing middle class eager to distinguish itself embraced these values. Waste, once merely a fact of life, became a source of shame. This change, more than any engineering, laid the groundwork for sanitation reform. The rural persistence of old ways. While cities evolved slowly, the countryside lagged behind. Rural households continued using open pits, field edges, and dung heaps for centuries. Chamber pots remained common well into the 18th century, emptied by hand or by tossing the contents out the door. Night soil was still applied to fields, especially in parts of England, France, and Germany. Entire villages shared wells located dangerously close to latrines. Medical understanding remained limited. The connection between contaminated water and disease wasn't fully accepted until the 19th century, despite anecdotal evidence for centuries. And so, for millions, the medieval pattern held: adapt, endure, and make do. The echoes of the garderobe. Even today, medieval waste practices linger in language, in architecture, and in quiet cultural memory. The word loo, used in the UK, may derive from gardes LO, the warning cry before dumping a chamber pot. Some old buildings still feature blocked garderobe chutes, visible as small vertical recesses in castle walls. Modern composting toilets borrow principles from dry latrines used centuries ago. The respect for those who clean up after others, though long undervalued, has deep historical roots. The story of medieval sanitation isn't just about filth, it's about the long, unglamorous work of making human life livable. And it reminds us that even the least noble labor can hold society together. Reflections on dignity and survival. Despite limited tools, medieval people confronted the problem of waste every single day. They carried chamber pots through narrow stairs, they dug cesspits by hand, they burned rushes to mask smells, they paid fines, broke rules, hired laborers, and improvised. They taught children where to go, they dug new pits, they adapted. They lived. It wasn't ignorance, it was adaptation under constraint. And for all their discomfort, their lives were full of meals, families, festivals, prayers, and survival. The presence of waste did not define them. Their response to it did. So we end this story with a thought. Is cleanliness the absence of waste, or the quiet work of managing it with care, humility, and persistence? Story 6. How people lit the night. Imagine standing in the heart of a medieval village after sunset. The sun has dipped behind the hills, the birds have gone silent, and a damp fog creeps over the cobblestones. There is no hum of electric light, no glow from street lamps, no overhead bulbs warming windows. Instead, darkness reigns thick, oppressive, and total. For most of human history, when night came, people adapted not by banishing darkness, but by negotiating with it. Light was rare, precious, and imperfect. It flickered, it smoked, it cost time or money. And so people lived in a dance with darkness, embracing it, fearing it, and sometimes revering it. This section explores how ordinary medieval people lit their world after sunset, and what that illumination or lack of it meant for their daily lives, rhythms, and fears. Light as luxury. To modern minds, lighting a room is a simple flick of a switch. But in the Middle Ages, producing light was labor-intensive and costly. At the core of this problem was fuel, light required. Wax for candles. Tallow rendered animal fat. Oil typically olive or fish-based. Or wood and charcoal for hearths and torches. All of these required resources either gathered, grown, or hunted. Wax came from bees who needed clean meadows. Tallow required slaughtered livestock. Oil had to be imported in many regions. And then came the tools: wicks, holders, lanterns, reflectors. Lighting your home was a decision. For the poor, it was often a luxury too dear to afford regularly. Most peasants, and even many townsfolk, simply went to bed when the sun set. Tallow candles, the light of the common folk. The most accessible source of artificial light in medieval homes was the tallow candle. Made by rendering animal fat usually from cows, sheep, or pigs, tallow was easy to produce, but carried certain disadvantages. It smelled strongly of burnt grease. It smoked heavily, leaving soot on walls and ceilings. It burned quickly and unevenly. Still, for those with livestock or access to a butcher's waste, it was viable. Candle making was often done at home, especially by women and children. Long wicks were dipped repeatedly into pots of melted tallow, cooled, then dipped again until the candle was thick enough to stand on its own. Tallow candles were used sparingly, lit for evening chores, mealtime, or brief reading of scripture. They might last an hour or two. Entire households shared one or two per night. Some thrifty families saved the stub ends, melted them down, and formed new ones every drop of light reclaimed. Beeswax candles, the light of the church and nobility. Where tallow burned in cottages, beeswax candles burned in cathedrals, castles, and manor halls. Beeswax was prized for its clean burn, pleasant smell, and golden glow. Unlike tallow, it didn't smoke heavily. Its flame was steady, and it lasted longer. But it came at a price. Producing beeswax required maintaining hives, harvesting honey, and carefully separating the wax, often reserved for ecclesiastical or elite use. Churches, especially, consumed vast quantities. High medieval cathedrals might burn hundreds of pounds of beeswax each year, funded through tithes, donations, and cathedral chapters. Royal courts used beeswax to signal wealth and taste. Candlelight reflected off gilded walls, chandeliers, and silver goblets. But even in palaces, light was rationed. To own beeswax candles as a private citizen marked you as wealthy or favored by the church. Oil lamps and fishy flames. In coastal regions, or areas with access to olive oil trade, oil lamps were used alongside candles. These simple devices held a small pool of oil and a floating wick. Clay or metal containers controlled the flame, which burned lower than a candle but could last longer. Fish oil, especially from herring or whale blubber, was more common in the north. It burned poorly and smelled worse, but it provided light in places where other fuel was scarce. Oil lamps were common in monastic cells, artisan workshops, and kitchens, places where steady light was more important than brightness. Still, like candles, they were managed carefully. Lamps were never left unattended. They were trimmed, refilled, and snuffed out before bed. A careless flame meant disaster. The hearth, light, heat, and community. For many, the central hearth served as the only evening light. A wood or peat fire glowed softly in a stone or clay hearth, often at the center of the room. Its embers provided just enough glow to see faces, stir a pot, or find one's way to bed. No candles, no lamps, just fire. Children learned to squint and work in semi-darkness. Elders recalled stories beside the fire. Meals were shared in its warmth. Light wasn't evenly distributed, it was localized. The far end of the room might be in total blackness. Many tasks were left until daylight. Only the most essential business was done by firelight. The hearth was not just the physical center of the home, it was the emotional and social one as well. Torches and rushlights. Beyond candles and oil lamps, the medieval world offered two other common light sources. Torches, bundles of resin-soaked sticks, used mostly outdoors or in castles for lighting large halls or corridors. They burned fast and required constant replacement. Rushlights, a poor man's candle made by dipping dried rushes in animal fat. These thin, flickering lights were cheap to make, but dim and short-lived, good only for brief tasks. Rushlights often sat in simple wire holders and burned for 10 to 15 minutes. They were the equivalent of striking a match or flipping on a flashlight, just long enough to see your way across a room or check a child's bed. Night was not for work. Given the limits of light, it's no surprise that medieval schedules revolved around the sun. Farm work ended at dusk. Legal meetings and council business were conducted in daylight. Travelers hurried to reach inns before nightfall. Shops closed early. The dark hours were for rest, prayer, and survival. This wasn't laziness. It was reality. Artificial light was expensive, smoky, fragile, and risky. Even kings didn't light their entire halls at once. They lit only what they needed when they needed it. Cultural life after sunset. Yet for all the hardship of darkness, night was not silent. In towns, candle-lit taverns buzzed with song and gossip. In manors, storytellers spun tales around the hearth. In monasteries, monks prayed at night vigils by oil lamps. The absence of light bred other senses. The sound of wind, the crackle of fire, the warmth of bodies near each other. The world didn't stop after sundown, it simply changed. And so we're left with a question. In a world that lived by the rhythm of light and dark, what did it mean to truly see, and what was only revealed when the lights went out? As medieval people settled into a world lit only by flicker and flame, their relationship with night deepened. It wasn't merely the absence of light. It was a time of altered reality when work stopped, when fears grew, when stories changed, and when entirely different rhythms emerged. Darkness reshaped daily life, dictated rest patterns, and birthed a rich culture of superstition, caution, and quiet observance. In this section, we explore how the medieval world lived through the long hours between sunset and sunrise, how people slept, feared, and even patrolled the dark. First sleep and second sleep. In medieval households, sleep was rarely a single, unbroken stretch. Instead, people followed a segmented sleep cycle, a natural response to the limitations of artificial light. First sleep typically began soon after sunset, around 8 or 9 p.m. People would then wake naturally sometime after midnight. This middle period, an hour or two long, was used for a variety of activities: prayer or religious reflection, quiet household tasks, intimate conversation or intimate relations, checking on livestock. Then came the second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This pattern was so common it appeared in religious texts, medical advice, and even legal records. Doctors, for instance, believed the waking period helped digestion. Monks used the interval for night vigils. The very structure of the night allowed for intentional, gentle wakefulness, something modern artificial light has largely erased. Sleep like light was broken and rhythmic. The fear of the dark. Darkness in the medieval world was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Without reliable light, people feared thieves and bandits lurking in alleys or along roads, wolves or wild dogs, especially near villages, fire set accidentally or deliberately, demons, spirits, or witches, believed by many to prowl under the cloak of night. Religious doctrine warned of temptations that rose in the darkness. The devil, they said, worked best when eyes could not see. Superstitions blossomed in this fertile ground. Tales of ghostly processions, of will-o'-the-wisps dancing in marshes, of devil's lights leading travelers astray. Children were warned not to look out of windows after dark. Certain crossroads, graveyards, and forest paths were avoided after dusk. To light a candle at midnight wasn't just an act of practicality, it was an act of spiritual protection. Night watches and urban curfews. In growing towns and cities, municipal authorities recognized the dangers of nighttime and attempted to control it. Many urban centers instituted curfews. Bells were rung around 8 or 9 p.m., signaling households to bank their fires and extinguish lights. Citizens were expected to remain indoors unless authorized. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire. To enforce this, towns employed night watchmen, usually low-ranking officials or guards tasked with patrolling streets after dark. They carried lanterns, rattles, or staves and walked in pairs or small groups. Their duties included deterring crime, catching curfew violators, checking that household fires were safely out, ensuring that suspicious persons weren't wandering the streets. Night watches were notoriously dull and dangerous. Visibility was poor, and attackers could hide easily. Still, they served a crucial function in making nighttime at least partially regulated. Villages, lacking funds for a formal watch, relied on informal neighbor checks or local custom. Some communities rotated the responsibility among households. Light and gender roles. The ability to control light also played a quiet role in defining gendered behavior. In many households, women were responsible for managing hearth fires, storing embers, trimming wicks, and keeping rushlights dry. Girls learned early how to dip candles, spin flax for wicks, and balance light duties with evening chores. Wives timed the lighting of candles to match their husband's return, not to waste precious flame. Men, especially those working trades, often needed steady light in the early morning or just after dark. Shoemakers, scribes, and blacksmiths, for example. In monasteries, nuns managed vast quantities of candles, especially for prayers. They kept detailed records of wax, wick length, and burn time, important for budgeting and for maintaining the sacred rhythm of hours. Control over light was part of the domestic, sacred, and labor economy. It was a tool and a responsibility. Festivals of light. Though light was usually rationed, certain times of the year called for its abundant use, especially during winter festivals. Candlemas, February 2nd, celebrated the blessing of candles for the coming year. Churches glowed with light. Candles were carried in processions, symbolizing purity and protection. Christmas and Advent marked the darkest time of year with extra hearths, lanterns, and tapers. In pagan-turned Christian traditions, like Yule, large communal fires were lit to welcome the return of the sun. These were not just religious events, they were emotional releases, reminders that the dark would end. People saved candles for such nights, planning months in advance. Lighting multiple flames was both ritual and rebellion against the cold, the fear, and the night itself. Monastic lighting and the rule of Saint Benedict. In monastic life, light was treated with reverence. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized moderation, silence, and devotion, values reflected in the use of light. Monks rose in the dark for matins, the night office, often the first duty before dawn. Candles and oil lamps were rationed, and reading or copying texts by artificial light was discouraged to prevent eye strain and waste. In some abbeys, monks had to request candles from a prior and return stubs afterward. Each flame was counted. Despite this austerity, monasteries were often the best-lit places at night, especially in chapels or scriptoria, where sacred work demanded precision. Their steady commitment to schedule and order made them islands of light in a dark world. Domestic light, rituals, and rhythms. Within the home, the use of light created small rituals. Lighting a single rushlight before dinner. Saving a candle for a night of storytelling or mending. Praying beside a flame flickering in a cracked clay lamp. Watching embers burn low before sleep. These rhythms gave structure to evenings. Families gathered close not just for warmth, but to stay within the narrow circle of light. Even in the poorest homes, lighting a small taper for evening prayer was an act of dignity and intention. The flame was fragile, but it gathered people together. So we must wonder, in a world shaped by flickering light, did the darkness make people closer or simply make them see one another more clearly? The night once belonged to silence, whispers, and flickering flame, but the gradual shift from a world of darkness to one of illumination didn't happen overnight nor evenly, nor everywhere. It was the result of centuries of small inventions, trade networks, and changing expectations about what light could do. In this final section of our story, we follow the slow but steady evolution of artificial lighting from the medieval world into the early modern period, where flame began to give way to something more permanent, and where people's perception of night and time itself would begin to change. The long dependence on flame. Even as the Renaissance dawned, most of Europe remained reliant on the same basic lighting tools: tallow candles, oil lamps, hearth fires, torches, and rushlights. The ingredients had improved slightly: better tallow rendering imported oils, beeswax from distant hives, but the essence remained unchanged. In many homes, especially in rural areas, lighting still followed ancient patterns. One or two candles lit at a time. Lamps trimmed with a metal pin or spoon. Embers preserved overnight under ash to reignite the fire in the morning. Some wealthier homes introduced wall-mounted candle holders, mirrored sconces, or glass lanterns to amplify the light. But the effect was still limited. Glass was expensive, and mirrors were often made from polished metal, not reflective as we know them today. Fireplaces became more refined, with flues and chimneys drawing smoke away, but the glow of the hearth remained soft, insufficient for much night work. For most, flame remained both a companion and a constraint. The growth of urban illumination. By the 16th and 17th centuries, as cities expanded and commerce increased, lighting became a civic concern. Some towns and cities began installing street lanterns. In Paris, royal ordinances required homeowners to hang lanterns outside their doors at night, especially in winter. In London, oil lamps began appearing at intersections and near bridges. Town guards and watchmen carried lanterns to identify themselves in the dark. However, most of these lights were infrequent, poorly maintained, and inconsistent. Oil was expensive, and the effort to light, trim, and protect open flames from wind was significant. Still, they marked the beginning of an important change: the idea that public spaces could and should be lit after sunset. This gradual increase in lighting led to later shop hours, nighttime gatherings, and a slow reshaping of the urban experience. Light and the regulation of time. As illumination improved, so too did humanity's grip on time itself. In the Middle Ages, time was loosely measured by the ringing of church bells, by the position of the sun or moon, by the rhythm of prayers and work cycles. But with better lighting came the rise of mechanical clocks, first in monasteries, then town squares, and finally in private homes. Artificial light allowed people to extend their productive hours, to read, sew, or write after sunset. This, in turn, gave meaning to precise timekeeping. Over time, the natural boundary between day and night, so clear in earlier centuries, began to blur. And with that blurring came the modern conception of night as an extension of the day, not merely a pause between light. Scientific curiosity and the flame. In the age of exploration and scientific inquiry, light became a subject of fascination. Alchemists and early chemists experimented with phosphorescent materials, substances that glowed in the dark. While many claims were exaggerated or false, some led to discoveries about combustion, reflection, and the properties of flame. Leonardo da Vinci sketched ideas for mirror arrays to enhance natural light. Others tested lenses and prisms, wondering whether light was a particle, a wave, or something else entirely. Candle making, once a domestic task, became more commercialized. Specialist chandlers emerged, using molds, braiding wicks for cleaner burns, and adding scents or colors to candles. The flame was no longer just practical, it was symbolic, scientific, and aesthetic. From flame to fuel. By the 18th century, change accelerated. Coal gas lighting emerged in parts of Britain and Germany. Lamp posts fed by gas pipes were installed in some wealthy urban districts. Glass manufacturing improved, enabling better oil lamps with protective chimneys. Snuffers, lamp scissors, and adjustable burners became common tools. These weren't medieval tools anymore. They were pre-industrial, heralding the coming energy revolution. Suddenly, a consistent, centralized light source became possible. But even as gas lights flickered on city streets, much of Europe still lived under the gentle reign of the candle, holding on to the dark. Despite all progress, many resisted the intrusion of light. Farmers continued to rise and sleep by the sun. Religious orders warned against indulgence and waste. Poets and artists romanticized the shadows. There remained a cultural reverence for the night. It was a time for rest, reflection, and quiet. In contrast to the glowing modern world, darkness offered intimacy. The medieval relationship with night wasn't merely technological, it was emotional. And even as oil lamps gave way to gas, and later, electricity, people retained an instinctive understanding that the world was once governed by the rhythm of sun and fire. Epilogue: what we lost when we gained light. Today, the night is rarely dark. Cities glow from space. Phones light our faces in the hours once reserved for dreams. Candles are ornamental. Lamps flick on without thought. But in gaining endless illumination, have we lost something? The medieval world knew the value of a single candle. It knew how to stretch flame into comfort, how to ration light for meaning, how to shape time itself around the arc of the sun. In every stub of beeswax and smoky rushlight, there was a choice. What to see, what to preserve, what to do before the darkness returned. And so we might ask, has the convenience of light dimmed our awareness of its meaning? And can remembering the darkness help us see the night with clearer eyes?